Hi all, and welcome to Brick by Brick, the podcast for the property development industry. My name is Ian Humphreys and I am a co-founder of Brickflow and one of your hosts. Each week we'll be speaking to experts and stakeholders from across the property development sector. We'll share ideas and advice on how to get ahead of the game as a developer, as well as trends and insights from across the sector. The series is designed for all experience levels. Whether you're just starting out on your property development journey or you're an industry veteran, we'll handpick topics with universal appeal so we can all continue to learn. We'd also love you to share the podcast with your development industry network. Our mission through Brickflow and the podcast is to make development finance better. Every year, somewhere between a third and a half of all SME property developers cite lack of finance as the main reason they don't build more. It's only through raising awareness of the problems that developers face that we will improve. The more people will hear this, the more the industry will pay attention and the better it will become for all of us. So please share as far and wide as you can. We also really want you to join the conversation. If you have any suggestions for future topics or guests or thoughts on any of the podcasts, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch through LinkedIn or Facebook or email us at podcast@brickflow.com. I hope you enjoyed the show. This week, I'm delighted to welcome John Wallace from Ridgemont. Ridgemont are a specialist real estate and construction law firm based in London. The main reason I wanted to get John on the show is for him to explain what a specialist construction lawyer's role is in the property development process. For most people, it's a bit of a dark art and perhaps an underappreciated skill. We speak with less experienced developers who believe that the person who did their conveyance for their main residence or their last buy-to-let is also the best person to advise them on all things construction. That might be the case and they might very well be a specialist construction lawyer, but the chances are that they're a regular property lawyer and would concentrate on the land acquisition part only, whilst they would reach out to someone like John to help with everything else. Property development is high stakes, and like a lot of other things in life, if you don't take the right advice or pay the right price for your advice, then it could be very costly later on. So, welcome, John.
Hi, Ian. Good to be here.
Good to see you. So, we like to start off by asking everyone about their journey, how they've got to where they are today, a bit about your background, your career today. What first attracted you to the property sector, and why do you love what you do? Do you love what you do?
Yeah, luckily, not everyone does, but I do. So I read law at the University of Liverpool. I then lectured at the University of Bordeaux for a year in contract law, came back, went to Nottingham Law School, then trained and worked at Eversheds in London and Paris. So in Paris, I qualified into real estate finance, acting mainly for one UK funder, securing large loans over chateaux, vineyards, golf courses. My daily commute was walking under the Eiffel Tower across a bridge to work. It was pretty ideal.
So your French is pretty good then as well.
Yeah, it's not bad. I still practice a little bit in French at the moment. I've got a client who's actually Spanish, and we speak in French because it's our common language.
Oh.
So the 2008 recession hit. There was no financing going on, no property deals. So I retrained as a property and construction litigator, which I thought would be a bit more recession-proof. Yeah. And then 5 years ago, this month, we launched Ridgemont, and Ridgemont specializes in real estate and construction matters. So anything contractual or any disputes is our expertise, and that's what we focused on. Now, I'm really lucky that I love what I do. So I've always been interested in property. Before I qualified, I paralegaled in the construction team of a Mayfair law firm, and then when I did my trading contract, I made sure that my first seat was in real estate. So it's something I've always been interested in, and now I get to practice law in a really interesting context, talking about apartments in super prime locations, big developments in central London, that sort of thing. And to me, that's really, really exciting.
Yeah, great. And I mean, do you have property in the family? Is their interest Is your father a property developer or anything?
No, not at all. My dad was a teacher. My mum worked in a bank as a bank clerk.
Right.
I was the first lawyer in the family, and no construction connections.
And who is Ridgemont? What does it consider? Is it you and others?
So I it's my firm, and then we've got a team of very experienced construction and property solicitors.
Right.
Three of whom have been working in construction for over 20 years, and so we're I have got some grey hair now, but they've definitely got the grey hairs for where that's needed.
Yeah, some people just want to see grey hair in the room, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. They're getting more and more these days, put it that way.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for that. So can you explain to the audience your potential role in a property development transaction? So when do people tend to hire you? What's the scope of a construction lawyer's services?
So we're generally involved across the project. So from looking at funding agreements, to construction documentation, which is the contracts, collateral warranties, bonds, etc., and then ad hoc advice along the way in terms of how to interpret the contract, dealing with issues as they arise, and then of course real kind of niche is advising on disputes, which often go to adjudication but can also go to the courts.
Most people, when not all developers, but perhaps less experienced developers, will just reach out to the guy that did the conveyance on the main residence. So, what would they work with them and you, or do you think it's better just to work with someone like yourself, or what is there a right or wrong, or is it?
All I'd say is that construction law is a very specialist area, so it's very technical. The legislation is very technical. The contracts, as drafted, are very complicated.
Yeah.
And there's a huge amount of case law.
Yeah.
And I've got a lot of respect for kind of generalist lawyers. I think there's a place in the market for them. But I think if you are embarking on a development and it's costing a significant amount of money, then you do need specialist construction lawyers. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. And I mean, give me a couple of examples, sort of case studies, things that you've done recently. Where there's definitely been a value add.
Well, it can be very simple. So this last week, I've been advising a new developer, fairly substantial first development. They've been advised by their architect and their kind of local lawyer. And the first thing that I realised was they didn't understand the contract, the mechanisms within the contract. Wow. And that seemed crazy to me, that they were going to invest a huge amount of money and not understand how the contract worked. The second thing is that the architect had drafted the contract and hadn't drafted any amendments to the contract. Now, certain contracts lean certain ways. In the JCT suite of construction contracts, this one in particular is contractor lens, in that it's some of the terms that favour the contractor. Right. And so you have to amend them by a schedule to the contract, and they just hadn't done that because it's not, architects aren't lawyers. It's not within.
Yeah.
And that seemed to me to be a big gap, and so we're now instructed to produce those under time pressure, and without that, things could go really well for the first 3 or 4 months of the build, and then you find something happens like COVID-19.
Yeah.
And then they turn to the architect, and the architect says, "I don't know what to do."
Yeah. I mean, I think what we've seen a lot of at the moment is obviously supply chains under pressure. So, perhaps that's easing a bit now, but a couple of months ago, when we were right in the middle of lockdown, you were seeing people that wanted to be on site but just couldn't be on site because, well, through no fault of their own or their contractors, but. Like that's just a completely. There's nothing you can't legislate for that. So yeah,
you can. You can legislate for it, and we might see legislation arising out of COVID-19 in respect of pandemics. But I think so. The problems, you're right, were supply chain problems. So builders, merchants closing, and there was some confusion as whether they had to or not. Bags of cement being sold on eBay, that normally are £5 or £10, being sold for £55 a bag.
I didn't see that.
Yeah. So, difficult situation. And of course, you can't build without materials, that's for sure.
But in that scenario where you've got a fixed price contract and delivery time schedule, I mean, what happens? Like, is it just a case of let's check the contract, or how do you work it through?
I mean, it's quite a complicated issue, but in a nutshell, you can have clauses that deal with increasing costs. You can have clauses that deal with force majeure. Now, traditionally, force majeure doesn't cover things like a pandemic because it's never been, there's been so few of them. And I know that there are lawyers in London at the moment looking at the definition of force majeure in the French Civil Code, because in some contracts it's not defined, and so there's going to be a huge amount of dispute in the third and fourth quarter of this year relating to delays and extensions of time caused by COVID-19.
Yeah. I mean, we one of the things that we saw and we hear about a lot is obviously lenders extending their loan terms. Some lenders automatically extended everyone's loans by 2 or 3 months, but there's a process for that as well in terms of it has to go back to credit, it has to be agreed again. Then there's a case of does the loan still fit within the original metrics, the original covenants? Have GDVs changed? All this kind of stuff. And then there was obviously surveyors and QSs couldn't get out to site. So I mean, it did cause a lot of problems. And I mean, have you started to see anything from your clients where there's going to be disputes with lenders, or is it going to be, is this something that's going to take a little while to work out?
I think it's really interesting that the banks have taken a collaborative approach and do seem to be on side and trying to help as much as possible. I think what we're seeing is that they're looking for developers to be less leveraged than they were pre-COVID.
Yeah.
We're also seeing that they're open to COVID-style clauses being inserted in respect of a possible second wave of the virus and possible restrictions on construction during that second wave.
Right.
And perhaps we're seeing some lenders being unwilling to lend on developments where apartments are going to be on sort of the upper end of value scales, or where there's sort of potential complications in terms of values further down the line. I think there's some concern that house prices are going to fall. I'll let others make a decision on whether that's going to happen or not. But I think that it's definitely playing on the mind of the lenders. But having said that, you will know better than I, the lenders want to lend, and that's how they make money.
Yeah, I mean, what was interesting is really the division between the types of lenders, their behaviour throughout. So the banks were still very much open for business, albeit they may have reduced their leverage. But whereas we saw the funds, they were non-banks. They were perhaps were more ready to put things on hold. I think it's down to a couple of reasons. Like, firstly, they don't have as much control over their funding. They're normally beholden to another investor. So there was probably a lot of checking that that their existing pipeline was correct and that they still had the backing of those lines. But also, I think for most of the non-bank sector, especially, they've only really known good times. Like you may know better than I, but back in sort of 2008, 2009, there wasn't a non-bank sector. You borrowed from a bank and that was it. So, these sort of lenders that are in the space now, which do an amazing job and offer such a wider range of product for developers, which is fantastic. Most who have only known good times. So they, when you get to a situation like this where perhaps we are teetering on the edge of a recession, they are naturally going to be a bit more nervous, and there's probably going to be some deliberation internally as to whether whether they just carry on regardless. So I do think there is a bit of that.
Yeah, I can understand that. And I think another issue that the lenders are thinking about at the moment is the strength of covenant from the contractors. Yeah. So is the contractor, likely to go under? All the contractors are under pressure at the moment. I'm advising a number of contractors at the moment who are just not being paid. They have staff on furlough, and the furlough scheme will end. So there's a lot of question marks over contractors. And I think that if I was seeking finance now in relation to a development, I would be looking for a contractor who's been around for a while, has good financials and a good reputation. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, some lenders have always had the rule around contractors as to what they're looking for, and some are sort of starting to introduce it. And we commonly see, a multiple of turnover versus contract value. So, if your contract value is $1 million, they want to see turnover of 3 or 4 million, for that to apply. But I guess you could look at it the other way, because we've had some instances of developers we've spoken to who their contractors have gone under, not necessarily due to COVID, but in that instance, if you have the experience, would you perhaps go the other way and manage your contract yourself? Because then at least you have, and this would be only obviously available to an experienced developer who's done it multiple times and perhaps even has a background themselves as a contractor or project manager. But would that be something that you think you might see more of?
I mean, that ultimately comes down.
Right?
Yeah, it comes down to a commercial decision. I think a lot of developers wouldn't have the expertise to do that, even if they think they do.
Yeah,
I think it's also nice to have a main contractor on the hook if something goes wrong. And particularly if, for example, the subcontractor was to go under. But yeah, I think we might see more of that. And I think developers might be forced to be more creative over the next 1 to 2 years until we get back to some kind of normality and the lenders have more confidence.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I should probably note from a funding perspective, most lenders prefer to see a main contractor in place, because obviously step-in rights are easier to enforce if there is a main contractor. If you've got 10 different subcontractors, it's a much harder position for the lender to step in and carry on. So it is the lenders will normally ask for that, but if all you're faced with is contractors that you don't think are going to be there at the end, it's kind of which is the lesser of two evils.
I mean, the other thing is profit, right? Because if you can knock off the main contractor's overhead, then obviously
that's it. Yeah, I mean that's the attraction for most developers. Okay, you touched on it earlier, just with performance bonds and collateral warranties, and do you want to explain those points a bit more? Because I think to some people they hear them but perhaps don't quite understand them.
Yeah. So, I mean, collateral warranties are the key documents that a lot of people don't understand, and essentially they're very simple in that in a situation where you've got a lender, employer, main contractor, and subcontractor, it enables the employer and potentially the lender to sue the subcontractor, where otherwise they just wouldn't have any contractual right to do so. So, for example, if the main contractor was to go under, they'd still have that cause of action, that right to sue the subcontractor. And this is absolutely essential for lenders for obvious reasons, but equally so for clients, for employers. I mean, to be honest, they're mainly on standard terms and they're not lengthy documents. So if you get hold of one and read it, they are fairly straightforward, but sometimes the concept is a bit strange to some people.
Yeah. Okay. And performance bonds?
Bonds are there, for example, where there's some concern with for example, the main contractor, and that is them putting down some security to ensure that they're going to perform the contract. Again, they tend to be fairly straightforward documents, but I suppose the devil is in the detail, and the value that we add is to make sure that they're as favourable to the contractor or the lender as possible.
I mean, do you think they're worthwhile? Are they something that you generally tend to say to people to take if they're available?
You're asking a lawyer whether an extra layer of securitization is a good idea. And the answer is a very definite yes, particularly in the
are they worth the paper they're written on? I mean, is it just, it's for show? I mean, do you actually see, them ever being claimed upon or?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And there's case law regarding that. They do get claimed upon.
Yeah.
But obviously, if a contractor goes under, the bond, is fairly meaningless.
Yeah, right. Okay, thank you for that. So let's get a bit more into detail on the finance side. So when we're working with a borrower, we will always ask whether they have a specialist construction lawyer. So a lot of borrowers will speak with their lawyer at that point, and they will say yes, whereas reality is they don't have a specialist in-house. They probably have a generalist, as you touched on earlier, and then maybe reach out to someone like yourself. If we've got that situation, how does that, how much of your work is done on that basis where you're being outsourced to, or how much is done with, where you're direct with the client?
We do accept instructions from other law firms that don't have construction departments. And I mean, we're in a lucky position where there's actually very few specialist construction law firms in the country.
Yeah.
And there's even, there's not many small to medium-sized law firms that have construction departments. So we do get instructions from other law firms, and we're happy to do that, provided that we see everything. But normally we're engaged directly from the start of the journey right the way through to the end. And I think that's probably the preferred way, because it means that we don't miss anything and we can stop issues arising before they happen.
Yeah. So if I'm looking to buy a piece of land, let's say I'm buying something that has permitted development rights, I'm considering whether to enact them or to knock down and start again. Obviously, I'd need to get separate planning for that. But let's say I've got a stub lease with an existing tenant. You could advise on all of this as well. So you could obviously go through the tenancy itself and then work with me on the planning. I mean, how would your role work?
I think it's really important that we get engaged prior to heads of terms being agreed.
Yeah.
Because often the legal and commercial points that we bring to the table will affect the amount that is being agreed in terms of the acquisition price for land or property.
Yeah.
And often the client doesn't see the problems that are going to arise further down the line.
Yeah.
And if the heads of terms have already been agreed, albeit they're not binding in this country, it's very difficult then to get tracked back over them and say, well, actually, I don't want to pay that much for it.
Yeah, you've lost your leverage.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No, it's really interesting. I think you kind of touched on it there. The residual land value. That's the saying is always that's where developers make their profit, right? In the land purchase price. So
yeah. And we often see first-time developers overpaying for land, and it's then very difficult to claw yourself back to profit.
Yeah, you're constantly chasing your tail then, aren't you?
And the land prices at the moment are high. I think there's too many developers who are going in blindly, and that normally comes with a lack of experience, paying too much for the land, perhaps underestimating the cost of construction, and then running into difficulties along the way. You suddenly are in a position where you're loss making.
Yes. Yeah. I think we hear of it, and you do see it from time to time as well. That people walk away sometimes flat, sometimes negative. If and normally it comes back to paying too much for the land. If you go into a proper contract with a contractor, unless they go under, then you would expect the build cost to remain fairly static. And then you've also got with the GDV, again, unless there's like a 2008 type recession, you'd expect that to be fairly constant throughout. So it is really the land price that kind of dictates that profit and success.
I think there's also a chipping away on profit from having insufficient contingency monies for the cost of construction.
Yeah.
And then when that's factored in with lower sell-on prices per unit, that's where you can run into difficulties as well.
Well, I mean, we talked about fixed price contracts. I mean, to most people, fixed price contract means fixed price. So, there is a contingency in there, as we all know, that, lenders generally insist on a certain percentage as a contingency, but then they also want to see that there's enough buffer the client holds personally to cover cost overrun. So, why is there, we've got fixed price, but then we still need to hold back, £500,000 to cover the what ifs?
I think that's because there's not really a fixed price construction contract. There's going to be variations along the way. There's going to be issues on site that have to be overcome. Often the employer will change their mind about certain things or seek planning permission again to improve the permission they've already got, which will involve further costs. And so this idea that there's a fixed price is just not right. I'm advising a developer at the moment in a similar situation where they've gone massively over budget. A new developer, they thought it was a fixed price contract, and of course it wasn't. And now they find themselves in a situation where they're going to have to take additional funding. And you're telling me it's very difficult to go back to the funder at that stage and say, we got our maths wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a question of credibility for one, but normally most borrowers they're borrowing up to the hilt of what that lender will advance, and especially in the current climate where you might have seen a little bit of heat coming off the prices as well. They've probably negotiated this loan at a point in time when GDVs were a bit more bullish, or certainly valuers would have been a bit more bullish, and now you're going into a situation where the lender might be on new applications taking a reduced leverage position, and you're trying to extend an existing loan in the current environment. I can see that being very difficult. But what I would always say, to your client and to anyone is that if you do run into difficulties, be the lender's best friend, because they will work with you. What I think is perhaps a bit different, even with some of the bigger banks with development finance, is there is still like a lot of personality and relationships involved with it. And I think the departments, even within the big banks, have quite a good degree of autonomy. So if they say, look, John's behaving really well, and yes, he's over budget, but he's given us weekly updates and we know exactly where we stand, that's a much easier sell to the people higher up the chain that are deciding whether to advance the extra 100,000, couple 100,000 that's needed. Whereas if you've got a guy who just sticks his head in the sand and just goes incommunicado, then they're the ones that the lenders are going to have to appoint receivers and get nasty. So I'm sure you're telling them the same thing. But yeah, definitely don't go dark, I think is the advice.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so going back to the contract when sort of lenders are involved. So what do lenders typically insist on as a sort of standard? I mean, we've touched on collateral warranties and things like that. Is there anything else that that borrowers should be aware of?
What I would say is that the starting point for this documentation is quite standard. It doesn't change an awful lot, and depending on the size of the borrower and the size of the amount they're borrowing, the lenders can actually dig their heels in the sand and refuse to negotiate a lot of the points because they want to keep their loans on standard terms so they know where they stand, and you can understand that. Yeah. Obviously, the more that you're borrowing, the more there is flexibility there. Typically speaking, though, you'll have a substantive funding agreement. You can expect to see perhaps a personal guarantee, performance bond that we've discussed, the collateral warranties in favour of both the employer and the lender, and then the appointments and so forth. The banks, the lenders want to see that the documentation is fully in place and it's kind of comprehensive, and that's why you need a construction lawyer, because that's our bread and butter. It's what we do every day.
Yeah. And do you work both sides, client side and funder side?
Yeah, we work for some funders and we work for clients as well, and I think that gives us an insight into the what both parties are looking for in the arrangement, and to try to everyone wants to get to the point where the money's drawn down, and so be collaborative, try and understand your opposing side, and try and get everyone there with an agreement that both sides are happy with. Yeah,
I think that's great. It's great insight, isn't it, when you've worked both sides, because then you know what they're perhaps willing to bend on and what's just a waste of breath, as it were.
Yeah.
But I think we saw a recent example where the borrower's lawyer raised 46 objections to the loan agreement. I think the lender moved on 2 of them. So, is that the norm?
That strikes me, and I don't know the lawyer, but it strikes me as someone perhaps who's not used to negotiating these agreements, and doesn't understand the response of lenders in those circumstances. 46 amendments, you've got to ask yourself, unless the document was very badly drafted in the first place. It sounds like it may have been amended for the sake of being amended, but you've got to. This week, I've just
certainly riled the other side.
Yeah, for sure. And it can result in papers being pulled and you lose the funding. I've been advising a client this week, and I advised them there were a number of issues with the contract. I said that ultimately the fund is not going to move, but there's one element of it which has to be changed, a key point, and we will get that changed. But if you go to them with 46 points, then they're going to think that your client is inexperienced and doesn't understand the game, and that's going to raise red flags.
Yeah. No, agreed. Okay, and how have you seen documentation change over the years? Like, what do you see now that perhaps you wouldn't have seen 5 years ago, or even pre financial crash in 2008? How's the documentation changed, and what's is it more favourable now to lenders? I presume it is. I presume they keep learning and putting more clauses in.
I think it's generally tightened. I think that post-COVID, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens once lenders have sat back and considered their position, because at the moment everyone's hoping that the property market's going to bounce, and the lenders not really tightening up too much at the moment. And they're allowing these COVID clauses in quite a lot of the time. I've got a feeling that post-COVID, I would have thought second half of this year, we're going to see a tightening of what they're prepared to negotiate on within the funding agreements. I think they're definitely going to require less leverage, more security. And you can understand that, because at the moment, we don't know where the housing market's going. We don't know where the commercial office market's going to go. Retail is in a hole. Yeah. What was very sexy, student housing, well, that's worthless at the moment because there's no students going to university, and we don't even know whether they're going to university come September.
Yeah.
There's a lot of unknowns for lenders at the moment, and I think perhaps that goes back to some advice that you'd give developers when approaching lenders, in terms of setting out what you're trying to achieve as clearly as possible with as much evidence as possible as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we've got some. We're looking at some hotel deals at the moment, which I think development's quite different to a lot of other parts of the industry where you're raising funding on property, because what you're building is 2-3 years away from delivery. So the now is not necessarily the situation is going to be in 2 or 3 years time. So I do think lenders are a bit more pragmatic and take that point of view. If you're a bridging lender or a buy-to-let lender, what's happening today with COVID and all those things needs to be a bit more at the front of mind. I think when you're delivering a hotel that's 3 years away from completion, then hopefully today or what's been happening the last few months is a distant memory. But it's no doubt going to impact on how the funding is underwritten. But I think also as well, the not the sad thing, but the big downside for developers at the moment is how the property is going to be valued, because I mean, valuer's job at the moment is incredibly difficult. I do really feel for them, but they're going to be pessimistic on things. Whereas again, if we do have a quick bounce back and in a year's time everything and there's a vaccine and everything looks quite rosy, that pessimism is perhaps undue. So it's a very tricky situation. But I do think, as you keep saying about towards the end of the year, you're probably going to see more sort of difficulties coming out that it will actually have a positive for developers anyway impact on land prices. So I do think you'll start seeing some land price changes, maybe Q3, Q4, Q1 next year. Because at the moment, what we're seeing is, and you may feel the same, but what we're seeing is sellers this has not touched their opinion on what their land is worth.
Yeah, and I think that the issue is that there's still great demand for land, particularly in London. There's still huge demand for it, and so, and then in terms of commuter belt as well, you see it. But I agree with you. I think that post October, end of the summer, October, November time, there's going to be a lot of redundancies across the UK, and that's going to have a huge impact on the housing market. And that's when we'll see land prices fall. And it'll be interesting to see the impact that has on lenders' appetite to lend.
Yeah, I mean, do you think you'll see a flight to the country? Do you think people? I mean, I personally, when COVID struck, we actually went down to Bristol and lived with my mother-in-law for a couple of months, and as partly because we just had a baby, so it's helpful to have an extra set of hands, but also just didn't feel that safe in London. So, to sort of be outside in the country, be able to sort of, self-isolate a lot easier. Is it, do you think that's going to play on people's minds and demand and things like that?
It's a really interesting question, and I'm really interested to see how quickly London gets back to normal. So already, I've been into the office 3 or 4 times since lockdown, and each time London's been a bit busier. The roads have been a bit busier. And I'm going in on Monday, and so I'm expecting to see it busier again. And by July, if the 2 meter rule ends, lots of people will be back in offices. We're seeing, there's talks of the pubs opening, restaurants opening. And the sooner that we get back to normality, I think the less of an impact it will have on the housing market. A bigger impact will be the economic situation, with furloughing ending, causing redundancies across sectors, which will ultimately mean that there'll be a reducing demand for housing.
Yeah. I mean, what about work? How people use workspace. I mean, not the company workspace, but actually their offices. Do you think there's going to be? I mean, one of the things I think that you might see a bit more of is people taking longer weekends, right? So if you technology allows and employers are perhaps being more flexible. Why live in London if you can live 2 hours away and you've only got to come in once or twice a week, surely it would make more sense. But in terms of offices, I mean, if you own a developer or you own a piece of land which has planning for offices at the moment, do you just go into it, quite bullishly and think that this is not going to have an impact, or do you perhaps start thinking that I want to try and do something else with this now?
I think luckily that's not my decision to make, but I think there's definitely concerns in the market about it. We may get to a situation where developers choose not to convert under PD. We'll have to wait and see about that. Yeah. I think more generally, there's definitely going to be an appetite for people to work from home, and we're in the fortunate position at the moment where we're recruiting. And during one of the interviews, the candidate made clear that they had enjoyed working from home across lockdown, and it would be a requirement that she could work from home 2 days a week. Now, I don't mind that at all, but some employers that might be an issue. Yeah. And from another legal spin on that is that we're going to see a lot of employees making flexible working requests to continue to work from home. And it's going to be difficult for employers to turn that down where those individuals have successfully been working from home during lockdown.
Yeah.
Now, what happens then when, I don't know, a large corporate has a huge amount of space that they've leased and half the workforce wants to work from home? That's a problem.
Yeah. My wife works for a very large software company, and they've never had enough space for all of their people in the office at the same time. They've always relied on only 80% of the workforce being in at any one time.
Yeah.
But I guess hot desking and things like that are completely contrived with 2 meter rules. So interesting to see how that plays out. But I can see a lot more of that. People taking less space and just allowing more. If you think everyone in London takes 20-30% less space, what's the knock-on effect of that?
The knock-on effect is huge. I was speaking a couple of weeks ago to one of my serviced office provider clients. They're expecting to be busier post-COVID because they think that larger companies are going to look for, rather than having one large space, a number of smaller spaces that can be more agile and they can, hot desk and they can, who knows what's going to happen to the economy. So if you go in on a 12-month contract, you can get out. It's much more flexible. So I think they'll be okay, actually. I think we might see a lot of empty office space, particularly the mid to large area size office space initially. And it'll be interesting to see. So if is this appetite for people to work from home, let's say over the next 2 years, whether that then recedes and actually people start missing the office. Because there's 2 key things to having an office. One is juniors learn a lot, and senior guys can and women can also learn a lot from each other. And then the other point, of course, is that there's the social aspect. So from working in London that a lot of deals are done over a table, over lunch, a beer after work. And I think people will miss that. And whether that happens now or that happens in a year or 2, we'll see.
Yeah. I agree with all of that. Okay, so moving on. So as you know, Brickflow is very much about introducing more technology into the sector as a whole. To our minds, the industry is horribly inefficient, and the commercial real estate sector is probably the last industry anywhere that's still in the main untouched by technology. So we always like to finish by asking you what your views are on technology in the sector, in the commercial real estate sector, but also more specifically in your sector, in the legal sector as well. I mean, where are the quick wins? Perhaps some of the things that have been forced upon us in the last few months, are probably things that were overdue and now they're just normal. But where do you see the sort of near future and perhaps the longer term future with?
So I'll start with the law and I'll talk about construction. So it's already been said that in terms of hearings, we're not going back to the old ways. So virtual court hearings have worked so well that the courts are saying that actually for a lot of hearings, that's appropriate. It's not going to be appropriate for everything. So for example, if witnesses are giving evidence in court and they're going to be cross-examined, then you kind of want your barrister to be in front of them, putting them under pressure. But there's a lot of administrative hearings in legal proceedings, and there's absolutely no reason why they can't be virtual. And it saves a lot of travel time, and it's much more comfortable for everybody. So I think that's going to continue. Law's got a long way, and when I say law, I mean law firms have got a long way to digitize. So most law firms that say they are tech savvy will have cloud-based practice management systems, enabling them to work from home. And then some will have some client-side tech that will enable clients to access documents. But there's not a lot of tech that's being used at the moment. So we've got things for sort of, if there's 10,000 documents to go through, there's artificial intelligence software that can go through them on your behalf with a great deal of accuracy. Yeah. But I think we're going to see more of that. So, and what the clients want to see, they don't want to see more client-side tech because there's only so much you can do in that respect. What they want is law firm side tech, which makes law firms more efficient, easier to deal with. And when we say more efficient, that means that the law firm then has to pass on that efficiency to the client. Because at the moment, law firms advertise that they use AI to make themselves more efficient. But that saving doesn't get passed on to the client. So I can see the clients are going to be smarter to that. Construction, you're absolutely right, is the last bastion of the pen on the back of an envelope, and that's going to have to stop. We're going to see intelligent contracts. We're going to see apps being used. So, for example, I know of an app being developed at the moment in relation to mental health on site. There's already existing things like that regarding health and safety on site, virtual training. I think there's going to be more about so this kind of idea of an intelligent contract, which kind of changes this idea of collaboration where everybody wins. So at the moment, contracts, the way that construction contracts are drafted is there's a winner and there's a loser. But ultimately, at the beginning of that journey, the development journey, all the parties want to get to the same position, is that built out and sold. And I think where we're going to see change over the long term, and I mean 10, 20 years, is a movement to some form of intelligent contracting that does that brings the parties together. That's going to involve legislation, though, because at the moment it's very adversarial, and they're going to have to legislate to change that. And that has to change. And the other area, finally, is actually in the way that we build. So the way that we build is fundamentally the same as the Victorians built. So we're going to see an increase in modular building. And I think there's going to be further advancements over the next 20, 30, 40 years in the way that we building quicker, smarter, more environmentally friendly. It's got to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the modular, I mean, do you take any different approach with modular than you would with standard construction?
There's obviously some different. There is a different approach to build because most of the work is done off site, and then it's.
I mean, in terms of the legal documentation, contracts, you know, where
they are slightly different, but fundamentally they cover the same points, and there's no reason why the law should complicate advances in technology. It's just normally the problem is that the law needs to catch up all the time. Yeah. And so when email was introduced, a lot of things like notice provisions in contract didn't allow for email, and so that's something that the law had to change to. And equally so, as we move on now into e-signatures, which are still are widely used, but perhaps not as much as you'd think. So, for example, all our letters of engagement are e-signed now, because frankly, I can't imagine anyone wanting to print out the letter of engagement, sign it, and then scan it back to us. So we're going to see. I think the law will have to catch up all the time, and it'll take really clever legislation to legislate for tech ideas that actually don't exist at the moment.
Yeah, I agreed. I mean, on the funding side, I mean, with Modular, the lenders, some lenders are okay with it, but most are still sort of waiting to see what happens. I think the big problem is obviously a lot of the cost is borne up front, and before you've actually added any value. So you've got a bare piece of land, and normally with traditional construction, you put some foundations on and you start building up, and it's becoming more valuable the whole time. Whereas obviously Modular, you have a bare piece of land, you give a contract to a modular construction firm who are building in a factory, and the land isn't getting any more valuable. And I think, there's that issue, but also, there's the resale, ongoing value. How do these things sell? Are they as desirable? How do they resell? These are the things that we're only going to find out over time.
Yeah, I'd point to other markets though. For example, Hof houses have been very popular in Germany for a long time, and have done very well. So I think once there's an issue in the UK market for modular homes where there's too many suppliers of modular build kits. That's going to consolidate over the next 5 years. And over the same period, I expect lenders to get more comfortable with lending on it, because for now, it seems to be the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And we had a borrower do bathroom pods, into a block of apartments, and he said it's phenomenal, the time saving. So the cost was pretty much the same, if not a bit more, but the time saving was just huge.
Even if you count the time spent manufacturing, it's still quicker. Taking that into consideration.
The time-lapse videos you see where they start putting these things together is incredible as well.
I like the story about China opening a hospital in 9 days. Obviously, it's longer because the whole thing had to be manufactured in a factory, but it's a nice story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and I don't know if you've seen as well. Have you seen the 3D printers with concrete, so they can put up a house perimeter and whatever in very short time frame?
There's a lot of concrete gangs who are nervous about that, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, scary stuff. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for that, John. I mean, that was really very interesting. I think I definitely learned stuff, and I think anyone listening would have learned as well. I think what you guys can bring, as a specialist construction lawyer is hugely valuable, and I think anyone should be looking to employ someone like you for any kind of construction. So thanks for joining.
Thanks for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
We'll catch up soon and see you soon. Take care. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Brick by Brick, the podcast for the property development industry. I think the biggest takeaway for me from John today was one of risk management. Property development is high stakes, as we all know. Developers risk potential bankruptcy each time they go into a deal. There's so many macro factors that you can't control. House prices, currency fluctuations that could affect the prices of materials, global pandemics that could shut the whole country down for months. All these things you cannot control, so why take a chance with the things you can control? Contracts being drawn up correctly and thought about and executed by experienced professionals are as important a part in property development as who you're working with. When things are going right, no one will give the contract a second thought. But when things go wrong, you'll need to know that you're covered. Yes, it might cost a bit more to have a specialist like John in your corner, but it'll be worth every penny for the peace of mind and cover it will afford you. Anyway, we'll be back again soon with another episode alongside other industry insiders sharing their own property journeys as well as their tips and tricks to help you get ahead in the property development industry. If you've enjoyed this show, we'd really appreciate it if you could leave us a review and share the podcast with your property industry peers. And remember to get in touch about this topic or any future topic by emailing us at podcast@brickflow.com. Until next time, take care.